podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A warm welcome, dear listeners, to today's episode of our podcast. And I have a very, very interesting guest with me today, namely Dr. Manfred Lerch, who has several things in common with me, but among other things, he earned his doctorate at the same university where I also earned my doctorate, and since this university isn't exactly the biggest one in Germany, namely the Bundeswehr University in Nürnberg, Munich, it is perhaps something a bit special. But that's not what today is about. Dear Manfred, I'm really glad that you're here today and talking with me. A warm welcome to you.
Yes, I'm happy to have the opportunity to talk with you today. And maybe to exchange a few thoughts as well.
Exactly, and that's what we're about. We want to inspire and motivate our listeners with topics, to spark value-based impulses, as we call it. But of course, we also have the topics of life itself woven in, and we want to connect those with values. And that's why, just briefly, as snippets, as thumbnails for our listeners, what can you expect here? First, of course, we want to pass the baton over to Manfred. I'll just briefly sketch out his background and ask him why certain things happened the way they did, so he can get a first impression of how things went in life, one way or another. But then we'll dive right into a really interesting topic, at least in my opinion. I've gained a lot of experience with this by now, since I've talked to so many people. What's it like to start out in a company as an executive assistant? The second topic, where Manfred is truly an expert, is railways. And we'll take a close look at that. He really knows his stuff and will tell us things that not many people know. The next topic is interim management, because at some point he was drawn to it, made the decision, and will maybe ask why. He's taken on interim projects in all sorts of different areas, and we've even worked together on some of those projects. And finally, the last topic. Very important, the changing world of work, and maybe also in light of technological developments. You put that really nicely in our preliminary chat, Manfred. You've already experienced several technological revolutions within a single working life that used to be different in earlier centuries. And what does that do? And what are the values that play a role in all this? So, that's basically the outline we've set for our conversation today. And let's quickly go over the main milestones. For you, kind of like a quick profile. Where are you from? I just mentioned earlier, the University of the Bundeswehr, that you studied aerospace engineering there, and you were also able to do your doctorate. It wasn't exactly the same time that I was there, otherwise we surely would have met and gotten along well. Then you went straight to MTU in the 90s, and you were there for 8 years in Voith. Railways, yes, very well known in that field, Belfort Beatty Rail, then also some time at Funkwerk, also as a board member, so a whole bunch of interesting positions, until you moved into interim management in 2015. Which means you've been doing that for quite a while now, and you're very, very experienced. And for me, that's really interesting. I always like to know why someone has taken this or that turn in life. So that's why I'm asking, why aerospace engineering, Manfred? Let's get to know you a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I did spend a bit of time reflecting on my past in preparation for today's conversation with you. And one thing I've realized over all these years is that you can only plan your career path to a certain extent. You always come to a crossroads and have to decide whether to go left, right, or straight ahead. And that's how your professional path unfolds. And I think most people would agree with me on that. And if you don't end up achieving the career you once set out for yourself, there's a big risk of being disappointed. So, that means you should take things as they come. Yeah, your question was, how did I get into aerospace? I've always been into technology, and towards the end of high school, of course, I started thinking about what I wanted to do and which direction I wanted to take. But I hadn't really come to a decision at that point. Back then, I had an uncle who was in the German Air Force and had made quite a career for himself there. And he said, "Hey, why don't you go down that career path and sign up for a certain period with the Bundeswehr?" So that's what I did. I went through the selection process. It was in Cologne back then. I think it's still there. And after finishing high school, like so many others, I joined the Bundeswehr. Younger people probably don't know this anymore, since conscription was abolished. But back then, as a volunteer, the process was the same. And then I chose to study aerospace engineering. Aviation is closely linked to the Air Force, so it made sense to focus on aerospace engineering, a specialized field within mechanical engineering.
Right, so you went straight into it, so to speak, and put your technical skills into practice that way. It's quite interesting that you bring that up, because I'm also from that era. I was still around during the time of compulsory military service, which hasn't existed for quite a while now. I was then a civilian at the Bundeswehr University, part of the teaching staff, so to speak, working as a research associate in the field of international politics. But of course, there was also the point that, compared to civilian studies, as a commissioned officer you also had certain obligations. You earned a salary. You also had decent accommodation there. And I found that, during the 7 years I spent at the university, it was a great campus, a fantastic opportunity to really study, to do a PhD there, and to really dive deep into your field. How did you experience that time?
Well, looking back, I can say it was a great time. There are still many friendships from back then. For me, there were actually 2 phases, the study phase after officer training. That was a prerequisite before starting university. We had 9 months. Officer training in Fürstenfeldbruck.
Then,
in October 1979, the studies began. Yeah, of course, when you come straight from school, going to university is a big step at first. And I really enjoyed campus life. It's actually very similar to the way people study at universities in the US. You're on campus there, so you don't really have to worry about housing and all that stuff, and you can fully focus on your studies, which was definitely necessary. Because, as you know, the standard period of study is, at the Bundeswehr University, 3 years and 3 months.
It's organized in trimesters there, not semesters.
Trimesters, there aren't any semesters, it pretty much just keeps going without breaks. And the summer trimester is then used for holidays and internships, which you also have to do during your studies.
So it's something special. Nice that you explained it a bit, too. And then, from there, you made the jump to MTU. And that actually leads me quite naturally to our first section. In various companies where I had the chance to consult, I've seen executive assistants, both men and women, at larger and mid-sized companies who start their careers there. And they say, okay, I'm not the CEO's assistant in terms of travel planning and that sort of thing, but rather for everything that. Strategically, it's really about having a role in projects and other things. So, you're right in the thick of things, you take part in all the meetings, you navigate through everything, through the company. And it's often a real boost for your career, because all of a sudden you start experiencing everything from a central vantage point, instead of just starting out as, say, a sales rep. Or I start here as a logistics specialist, or as a technician, or whatever else. So that means you very quickly get the impression, wow, okay, how does a place like this actually run? And as I said, that's often a boost for your career, for your development path. And now I'm really interested to hear your perspective, because I personally never had the chance to experience something like that. I never got to experience that, but I want to know, how did you experience it and what's your main takeaway from it?
Yeah, sure. So, first of all, maybe just a few words. It was a coincidence, or maybe a stroke of luck, that you probably don't experience too often in your career. I was just in the final phase of my PhD at the University of the Bundeswehr, and then one afternoon, Friday, I still remember it was a Friday afternoon, I got a call from a personnel officer at the university, saying that the company MTU was looking for an assistant to the board, and they would like to hire, well, a former officer as well, a young officer, and whether they could pass on my information. And then I said, without giving it much thought, yes, of course, gladly, very gladly, yeah, and that's how things started to unfold. Of course, I was then under a bit of pressure to finish my dissertation.
Maybe that's actually a good thing.
Yes, of course. And of course, it all had to be wrapped up within a few months so that I could then finish my doctorate, meaning the work was done. Yeah, and then, if you can imagine it, one day I was still sitting in front of the computer, working with programs and calculations on aerodynamics. The next day, I was sitting at a desk with my predecessor. In the office across from me, I suddenly had 3 companies, so, back then, the MTU group consisted of Munich, which still exists today, the engine components, engines. On Lake Constance, there were the diesel engines. In Munich, at that time, there was DASA, Deutsche Aerospace. Today, I think that's the only company left. Airbus. Everything else still exists in part, but in different structures. There were thousands of employees with many different cases. So, of course, each company had its own areas of focus. And suddenly I saw that and somehow had to make sure I kept my head above water and keep things steady. I had to get so familiar with the topics that I could really provide qualified support.
What was your boss like? Tell me, if you were to describe him. You don't have to mention his name or anything, but just so we get a sense, hey, there must have been a special relationship there. You really need that, so you can basically toss things back and forth almost blindly.
Yeah, I think with a job like that, where there's a one-on-one relationship, at least from me to him, you really have to be a good personal fit, or as they say, the chemistry has to be right. And it was. We were both techies, very down-to-earth and unpretentious, so I think it worked out pretty well. Although I have to say, even though I worked closely with my boss, there were times when I wouldn't see him for weeks at a stretch. Being an executive assistant, as you mentioned earlier, is kind of like a booster, a chance you get, and then you have to make something of it. You're basically sitting in the front row, but you're not on stage. But you're right up close. You're right in the thick of things, you see everything, and basically, you act as the backup for your boss. And there are executives who take their assistants along with them, so they're always there, see everything, and pick up on topics right away. And then they pass them on, or, like in my case, I worked more in the background. Most of the time, I tried to be at the same location, but I rarely traveled along, so I tried to support from behind the scenes.
But what I take away from you is that this real experience, I think, really broadened your scope as well. And in the end, it was a good introduction to the working world beyond what you did as an officer, what you did in the Bundeswehr, which is also incredibly important. But that actually brings me to the next stage that I'm interested in, because in our preliminary conversation, we talked about the railway, and as a regular, let's say, passenger, you use different modes of transport. You take a plane, you take the train, you take a ship, you drive a car, and with a car, you drive yourself. With the other things, it's a bit different. Would you mind giving us a bit of an introduction? Just for laypeople, I mean. What was it like to get into the railway industry, and what are some of those things? What are some points that maybe the average person should know, and that might be interesting, so people can see the railway in a different light?
Yes, absolutely. So, how did I get into the railway business? MTU, as I mentioned earlier, used to manufacture diesel engines on Lake Constance. And that was for all sorts of different applications. So from ships, back then there were also military uses, of course, including the railway, which at that time was still largely powered by diesel traction, meaning diesel engines. And only the high-speed lines and the heavily used routes were
Electrified, so to speak.
Served by vehicles powered by overhead lines. Yeah, and back then, at the end of those, it was 4.5 years, I think, as an executive assistant, and the question was, where to next? One option at the time was Japan. But that would have been more of a liaison position, and I actually wanted to get involved in something more hands-on, to get into operations. That's how I ended up in railway project planning. I was responsible worldwide for railway applications, both for the development of railway motors and for sales. Back then, I also traveled quite a lot. I got to travel a lot. I was in Japan, in Korea. Those were the main regions at the time, key focus areas. Later on, of course, Germany became more important again as well. And yes, when it comes to the railway currently has a relatively poor image, especially regarding reliability, which of course could be improved. Yes, and to your question, it's obviously very difficult to catch up on things quickly when you haven't invested enough or weren't able to over many decades. There are now various aspects to consider. Maybe let's start with the system itself. When you're traveling by train, there's the train driver at the front, sitting there and operating the vehicle, but actually, the train is controlled from outside, from a central control center via the signaling technology. There, the signals are set to green, and the switches are set as well. Then the train can depart, and the train driver is really only there for emergencies. So, only if there's actually a red stop signal and he has to stop there. That means the influence is relatively minor. Of course, it's also clear that on the tracks, you usually can't overtake. There are sidings where you can briefly move a freight train aside so that the faster train can pass.
So, there aren't really any sports car trains, so to speak.
To say, when you're traveling at night with an IC train, that doesn't help much because there aren't really any freight trains in front of it.
Yeah, okay.
And that's why it takes longer. At night it takes noticeably longer because on the railway, freight trains mostly run at night. The prescribed maximum speed and the tracks you travel on in Germany, unlike in France for example, are the same. France has built its own high-speed rail network. That means the traffic there is separated. We don't have that in Germany.
For the TGV, they basically have extra.
Exactly, for the TGV. The stations there are also outside the city centers. So you travel out to the edge of the city to board there. Not like here, where you go right into the center, where the main station is usually located.
Then,
of course, there's also the power supply and communication technology, which are important too. Somehow, the electricity has to get into the train, the signals have to be operated, and so on. So those three, and what I forgot, of course, is the infrastructure, the tracks the train runs on, they wear out. The railway system is designed so that the part that wears out is the wheel on the train, not so much the track itself, but the wheel, because it's much easier to replace than thousands of kilometers of track.
yeah.
Nevertheless, you also have to maintain the tracks regularly. Maintain them, grind them down, sometimes replace them, or replace the ballast in the track bed. If you fall behind somewhere, you can't just catch up on all these things overnight. That's one of the reasons why things are a bit more difficult with the railway at the moment.
But it's also, if I may just jump in for a second, pretty similar when it comes to car infrastructure. If you have constant construction sites, so to speak, which we all know, now you basically have those construction sites on the rail infrastructure as well, if you look at it that way, right?
Exactly, that's right, yeah. Just like you have to regularly replace highway surfaces. They wear out. You also have to do something about that with the railway. Another important point I wanted to add is, of course, that when you want to carry out modernization measures on railway infrastructure, you have to plan these construction projects. And then you have to implement them. So basically, you need engineers, both men and women, for the preparation, for the construction planning, and then for the actual construction work. And of course, since there hasn't been any investment for a long time, they're just not there anymore. There are only a limited number left. If our government now makes a lot of money available, that money can't actually be spent on construction because it simply can't be planned for. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but it'll certainly take many more years before we can even begin to catch up on what wasn't done in the past.
So, if I understand you correctly, Manfred, it's that maintenance, the upkeep of such infrastructure, always needs to be kept on a steady simmer. And if at some point you decide not to invest, you don't just end up with more traffic jams later on, but you also lose the people and the know-how.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. And
then the difference with highway construction sites is that traffic is diverted from one lane to the other. That's only possible to a very limited extent on the railway. There, they have full closures, so the traffic is stopped completely. Then you can get onto the tracks. For example, you can work from 10 p.m. in the evening until 6 a.m. in the morning, and then by 6 a.m., the line
has to be running again,
so that the trains can run again. And because of that, construction projects naturally take longer than originally expected. So, you don't work there 24 hours a day. The longest you can do is maybe over a weekend, from Friday evening to Monday morning. But then, of course, there's the pressure that the line has to be working again by Monday morning, because otherwise, the problems are huge. Yeah.
Unbelievable. It's definitely a fascinating topic. And you can tell the person talking really knows their stuff. You've really made a career for yourself in several companies, and you even reached the highest level there. What motivates you to say, now I'm going to do something different, because you definitely could have kept going there? I know that at first you thought about it for a while. You considered HR consulting, but in the end you ended up in interim management. But what were your reasons? I think our listeners are interested in that, especially when someone is so successful. When you're so established in a certain field with a specific background, why make a change?
Yeah, good question. At some point, during my long career in the railway industry, we just talked about the staff shortages there. I realized that there are very few HR consultancies in Germany that specifically deal with this topic. And also to know what kind of prior knowledge someone working in the railway sector needs to have, and who is suitable for which role. And that's when I met a colleague, a recruitment consultant I'd known for many years. That's where the idea came from. Let's set up a recruitment consultancy together that focuses specifically on these experts and executives in the railway sector, and that's what we did with USPC. It's been that way for decades. She'd been on the road for years and, of course, knew the topic of recruitment and executive search inside out. From A to Z. And I was the one who, over the course of my career, had hired many people and basically knew exactly what to look for. What do I need to look for? How can I select someone? And this symbiosis worked out really well. In fact, I then spent several years working in railway recruitment together with my business partner. Until a coincidence connected me with executive interim partners in Munich. The initial idea was that recruitment and interim management should somehow go together, since in interim management you often have to fill positions as well. That was the original idea. And then, for myself, that was the topic of the why. I quickly realized that hands-on management suited me more than working in a consulting role. Standing on the sidelines a lot, instead of actually doing things myself. So I got into interim management, and it just kept growing, to the point where I no longer had time for recruitment, and we mutually agreed to let that go. And since then, I've been working in interim management. Yeah.
But it's really important to learn through experiences like that. Hey, what am I good at? Where do I really excel? And it's also interesting to see that. During this interim period, of course you brought a lot with you from your railway background, but now it was more about the technical side of things. That aspect wasn't as important anymore. It was much more about being a leader, a manager. How do I lead effectively? And then, in projects, especially in a really interesting international project where we worked closely together, you were able to draw on your wealth of experience. You were able to put that to use. And how does it feel to be an interim manager, if I can put it that way?
Well, generally speaking, looking back, I have to say that with every change of company, you grow into the new company faster and faster. So the time it takes to get up to speed became shorter with each new position. Yes, and in the company you're referring to, I was there during the second phase of restructuring. At that point, it was more about further developing the company and also about selling the company. And the company had gone through a really tough time. The company culture was pretty much at rock bottom, so there was very little trust within the company. On the one hand, there was a lack of trust in management because of things that happened in the past, of course. The company narrowly avoided insolvency. I also learned this during my time at MTU from my boss back then, who said we always have to keep in mind that we carry responsibility, not just for our own employees, but also for their family members, meaning those who depend on someone working there. It's not just the 1,000 or 5,000 people for whom we're directly responsible. There's actually a whole lot more riding on it. You'd also be destroying value if you just let a company go bankrupt like that. So from that perspective, saving is always better than breaking things up and then sweeping up the pieces afterwards. I came into a company where the corporate culture was pretty much at rock bottom, and no one really had any faith in the future anymore. Maybe I can share a little anecdote about that. Every year on the 1st of May, we had an open house day. Every year on May 1st, we had an open house day. I was there for the first time in 2018 and the year before that. My predecessor. He asked a young guy who was there, "Well, now that you're here, don't you want to join the company too? Don't you want to follow in your dad's footsteps? Take over and build a career?" And then the little guy said, "My kids always have a choice." He said, "No, I don't want to, because the company is. Yeah, well, it's going to go bankrupt soon anyway, so there's no future in it for me anymore."
Honestly,
This topic really touched me because Then, in the following years, 2018, 2019, and of course by 2020 it wasn't possible anymore, but 2019 still worked despite COVID, I saw that these open house days kept getting better and better. There were more and more people. In that particular year, I think there were 300, and then, 2 years later, there were over 1,000 visitors. You could really see how the employees at the machines were proud and could show their families and friends what they actually do there. And so, the company culture gradually changed as well. The turnover rate went down, and people started to regain confidence and trust in management. And yes, I've now handed over the responsibility, and things are still going really well.
you're on the supervisory board, as you told me, and I'm also glad that I was able to contribute a small part. But you mentioned the topic of trust, which really is a key element. That brings us to the values that move companies forward. And Value Impulses is also the title. But let's try to connect the values that have carried you through your working life and maybe go into that a bit more. With these technological revolutions that are happening faster and faster, you said yourself, I've already experienced quite a bit in my life. And right now, with AI, we're seeing another leap forward. So if you look at this technological development, I really see it as exponential in some areas. On the other hand, we have some really important values where we can say, well, those are actually constant, if we're being honest. And how do you bring those together? What's your main takeaway from that? And which values are especially important to you when you look back on your working life? And also when it comes to technological development.
For me, it was always important to have satisfied employees who enjoy coming to work and like working with me. Of course, that also means sometimes you have to share truth that people might not want to hear. But even then, being straightforward is important, because in the end, even if it affects someone personally, you can understand it to some extent. And when you guide people through those processes, humanity is important there too, not coldness. Emotional coldness. Then some things become easier. So, I think what's important as a value, as a leader, is your own credibility with your employees, your reliability. And that you are authentic in what you do.
Yeah, which also means, of course, not making big promises or building castles in the air, because then your credibility can disappear really, really quickly. And you mentioned trust earlier, which of course is also connected to credibility. That's something that has to be built up, something you can't just hand over across the table like money, but in the end, it's something deeper. And in that context, maybe another question, if you go beyond credibility, beyond these core values, what are the things that matter most to you in leadership, in management? So, are there any other important factors where you'd say, yes, this really matters, maybe especially for the younger generation listening in, pay attention to doing this or that as well? So if you have any tips in that regard, as a successful leader and manager, that would be great.
At the beginning, you mentioned these multiple technological revolutions. If you look back a bit, there was a time when, technically speaking, not a whole lot changed. That meant you could join a company somewhere and maybe even make it to the top. And basically, the technology you learned about when you first started would still be familiar to you even from that higher position. Those days are long gone. So, if you think about it, depending on which field you're in, how quickly technological revolutions happen today. IT is, of course, leading the way. Especially now with AI being so current. And as a supervisor or leader, you can't know everything. And that's getting harder and harder, of course, so you really have to lead differently. And that's exactly where the topic of values comes into play. And what was always important to me was to explain how to the people who worked with me or to discuss it with them. To come to an understanding with the employees about how we want to do things and to say, this is how we want to do it. So that's where we want to go.
Yeah.
But not to tell them how to do it. If they come back and say, yeah, I'm not really sure, should I go left or right? Then of course I was there to support them with advice and assistance. But what I personally could never stand was being told what I have to do, and then also how I have to do it. And since I didn't like that, I said, I don't want to do that to my own people. Out of my own sense of responsibility, I never wanted to do that to anyone, so I always focused only on the what, and not on the how. How?
Totally.
A topic.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Yeah.
Which is also important when it comes to trust. It takes a long time to build trust, but you can destroy it really quickly. Then it's very hard to get it back, so you really have to lead by good example. You can't preach water and drink wine, you really have to walk the talk. I think that's important, especially in tough restructuring situations, which we often find ourselves in, to show employees, okay, I'm fighting right beside you for the future of the company, even if it won't be easy.
And with that, we're all in the same boat.
Exactly, we're all in the same boat, right, and we all have an oar in our hands. And it's not just one person with the megaphone and everyone else with the oars.
And you described that really well, especially in terms of leadership style. I learned that too, early on, how to do assessments. And so on, that you actually just ask the people you're assessing how their supervisor's leadership style is. So, not asking about their own leadership style, because of course, people tend to present themselves in the best light, but really working out what someone actually does as a leader. All right, someone else, and maybe what isn't so great, and that's where this point often comes up. And it's just human nature to want to have a certain degree of autonomy. In the how, as you just put it. Sure, we can agree on the what or the goal, whatever it may be, but then we also need to leave the path open. And I think, to some extent, these are also timeless things. Arguments in leadership, technology can advance as much as it wants. Exponentially. That remains, and that's why I think it's important that we communicate this, and I'm really glad that you were able to share this with us so clearly, both from your experience and your conviction. So, Manfred, great contribution here. I think we've covered all the points that were important to us. You made a great contribution here. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, my pleasure. I enjoyed it. It was a lively conversation.
Yeah, we really went off on tangents. And our structure held up pretty well, too. It's not always necessary, but sometimes it works out. And I think it turned out really, really well. It really brought everything together nicely. Dear listeners, thank you so much for sticking with us right to the end. Please give us feedback on what we're doing here. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or on the podcast platforms as well. I'm really happy about it. I'm glad you're here and I'm already looking forward to the next episodes. Manfred, it was really, really great with you. Thanks again, and to everyone, see you soon.